All right, everybody. So you are supposed to have read the first 3 chapters of MAUS, the first part by Monday. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a brief background into graphic novels to kind of help you with that. I thought about giving you a background to the Holocaust, but I feel like you probably know enough at this point. If there's something that happens in the text that you're unclear about, if you Google it, you'll find plenty of information on it. It's not like an obscure event that took place. So that should be easy to find if anything's unclear. If you stumble upon something and you want to ask me a question, you absolutely can. I tend to know a little bit about this, so I can probably answer your questions, but I'm not super worried about that. Okay, so I'm gonna share the screen. Okay, so in general, there's some debate about graphic novels. Perhaps you've never even heard of that. You don't know what a graphic novel is. It's essentially a comic book, a longer comic book. But also the way that it's bound, the way that it's put together, it resembles more of a novel. It gains some legitimacy because of that. So graphic novels tend to get a better reputation than comic books. And comic books, I'm sure you're aware of, are kind of like flimsy and thin papered and fairly inexpensive, whereas this one could cost you up to $30. So that's kind of the difference between these two. Some people like to think that graphic novels are higher literature, like intellectuals can read graphic novels, but they won't read comic books because they think that that's beneath them. I think that's ridiculous, but there are definitely plenty of people that make that argument. That's still something that is being discussed. And then there's a lot of questions about whether or not this should even be taught in a literature course. And in my opinion, graphic novels are becoming more and more popular. There's going to be more and more of them as you go through college. It's becoming a very important field in literary studies. So I think that it's definitely something that should be taught in literature courses. I also think they're really fun. It's just more exciting to read something that has images and text. And this graphic novel, MAUS specifically, deals with really complex themes and deals with it better than a lot of the novels I've read. So I'm all for it. I think you're going to enjoy this. It reads quickly. A lot goes on. It's easy to analyze. I think you'll enjoy it. So graphic novels, kind of like I said, became a form of legitimation. Like they got better and better. They became viewed as more productive, more legitimate. So you can see here I kind of included a couple graphic novels that you might be familiar with. So like The Watchmen is probably the most famous graphic novel. There was a TV show that just came out on HBO. Or was it Showtime? Either way. There was that show that just came out with Watchmen. There was definitely movies about it. There's also like Sin City. You might have seen that. And if you haven't, that's a shame and you should go see it. It's an excellent film. But also these are just other ones. The Gilbert Hernandez and the Hernandez brothers have put together a lot of different graphic novels, and Blankets happens to be a particularly famous one. But it's just become more and more legitimate. And I'm going to take you through the history a little bit. So first of all, the earliest comic books and graphic novels tend to have themes of heteronormativity, things that maybe we're not as used to nowadays. But back then, obviously, being a part of the LGBTQIA community was frowned upon or was hidden, and so it was a little bit less likely to be featured in one of these books. So you'll see here, like the Archie comics or this example of Lovelorn, that it's almost always a cis male and a cis female together in these images. And so it started out that way. If you think about a lot of the earlier superhero comic books also, like Batman and Spider-Man, like those are also constantly straight relationships. Again, more of these Superman, and I believe that's Wonder Woman, but I could be wrong. Catwoman and Batman, like these are, it's consistent. You'll see in images that it's constantly heteronormative. But in the 70s and 80s, something changed, and comic books and graphic novels became a site of rebellion. of going against the grain, of challenging the norms. And suddenly graphic novels and comic books became a place where the LGBTQ plus community could express themselves. And that's where we kind of get underground comics. They're not so underground anymore. They are now being made much more often. The relationships are definitely not nearly as heteronormative. And we're even getting some of these depicted in films based on these graphic novels. So it's progressed since then, but it definitely started as this really interesting kind of moment in the 70s and 80s where suddenly comic books were kind of taken over by the LGBTQ community in a very positive way, and they found a lot of ways to express themselves in these moments. And there are plenty of comic books that you can look at that are outrageous and great and speak to that. So you can see a few here. But that's continued, like I said, into now. So these are just another few examples of looking at the LGBTQ community through graphic novels. So we have Bingo Love, and those are actually women of color, which is even more progressive than what we would have expected in the 70s and 80s. And then also My Brother's Husband. But there are many, many more of these, particularly contemporarily. But it's just interesting to think about that moment in the 70s and 80s where comic books kind of shifted from superheroes and like hyper masculine Batman and Robin and Superman to this place where the gay community could speak out and express themselves. It's just a very interesting transition. So when you're reading a graphic novel, you have to think about the differences between a graphic novel and a novel, or even poetry in that sense, but just comics versus literature that, or more, let's say, I shouldn't say literature because graphic novels are literature, but more common examples of literature, things that you would have assumed, like novels and poetry and plays and whatnot. So you have to see them as a little bit different. So words and images are used, but also you have to think about how this is different than words. When we are just reading words, we rely on our own imaginations to kind of put that image in our head, but here the image is kind of put there for us. So it's an interesting lesson in how our imagination works when we read and how different this might be. There's also a little bit less reading and a little bit more looking. Like you have to look into the details of these images and start to see things that you wouldn't see just by looking at the writing. There is writing and typing, but there's also drawing, and sometimes drawing becomes writing. You'll see an example that they write their own fonts, they write with their own printing, so it looks a little bit different. We have silence and sound. The sound in this case is simulated, so if somebody makes a large noise in the graphic novel, it's going to actually show some sort of image of that noise taking place. Whereas if you're reading a novel, you're not going to see the sound. It might describe the sound, but you have to imagine it. This time it's going to be shown to us. Same thing with motion. We're going to see motion across the page as opposed to just having to imagine it. We're going to also see things cut into weird parts. Like we might read something as like one scene, but Spiegelman, who's the author of MAUS, is going to break things up in a specific way. And also every image is a little bit different, and they're cut out and they're framed. I'll give you the language in a second. So they don't run into each other necessarily. And if they do run into each other, then that usually means something that you might want to analyze in a paper. And then there's also this weird kind of interesting dynamic here where when you think of a novel, just any random novel, let me see, I think I have the textbook here. Like this guy, he wrote this and he knew that it was going to be mass produced. He knew that it was going to go to a bunch of different people. He typed it on a computer and he sent it to his editor, and we all kind of knew that this was going to be sent out to a whole bunch of people. Whereas if you look at MAUS, and I just happen to have it right here, if you look at these images, like Art Spiegelman drew these on a piece of paper, and so it was like an individual experience for him. Like this was originally on one piece of paper, and then it got mass produced. So it's this idea of starting small, having these very specific drawings, not necessarily for mass production, but somehow being mass produced at the same time. I hope that makes sense. So here we have an example of how the verbal becomes visual. So you can see this like weird thing flying in the air. I'm not entirely sure what that is. Maybe it's a helicopter of sorts, making this noise. So this whoop, 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 whoop noise. And so we see it, but you're meant to hear it at the same time. So it's this kind of weird juxtaposition between hearing and seeing. and coming together in this so that you can kind of visualize both. It can be complex and confusing, but if you were to analyze this, you might talk about the effect that this has on the reader. Like, what does it mean when there's a sound visually here? What does that do for you? How does that affect you? And then if you also think about how like the buildings in the background are very grainy in this picture, and you can't really make them out, and the sound instead is like really vibrant and you can read it, maybe the author is trying to really emphasize the sound in this moment as opposed to what we're supposed to see. So maybe there's an impact there that you're supposed to point out. So these like little details like that, I want you to find them and think about them and notice them and ask yourselves, why? Like, why would the author do this? How does this affect the reader? What would be the purpose of this? Okay. So like I said before also, that writing is drawing, so you can see like how this writing in both of these comics is extremely different. We have the first part in cursive and really large, and then we have this overwhelming image from a graphic novel in Palestine, which if you're interested in, I can bring some images into the class. And you can see that his writing is completely different in that versus the woman's writing on the other example. So every single bit of writing is going to have the author's kind of emotions put into it. It's going to be a little different. And so that gives every graphic novel just something, makes it a little bit unique. Unlike, I mean, you can change the font in a novel, I guess, but it all kind of looks the same and drones on. We also see that time is spatialized. So this is from Calvin and Hobbes, which is a great comic. If you have a chance to just like look it up online, you should. They're very cute. But you can see here, and this is going to be important in MAUS, you can see here how, I'll shake the mouse around this, how this tree right here kind of separates the time. So we can see back here, maybe it's kind of like winter, we're moving into this idea of fall, or maybe it's the reverse, I'm not sure. But you can see this tree versus this tree and the way that it's dividing the space. And so we see Calvin and Hobbes in this on the left side moving, like this is meant to be time passing, and then they're going over here. And you can even read, right, like, well, summer is almost over, it sure went quick, didn't it? Yep, as they are moving into the next frame. And so it goes from summer to fall, and then we're into winter. There's never enough time to do all the nothing you want, which of course is cute, but this shows us time moving. So sometimes spaces will be cut into pieces, and you can see the kind of before and after, or the earlier and later. Also, divisions like this can also indicate that like people are disagreeing, that one person's on this side and one person's on this side, and they have this break in the middle and they disagree with each other. So I want you to pay attention to the ways that images are cut and spatialized, okay? That's something that you can pick up on. So here are some of the terms that we're going to be looking at and that I will occasionally use and sometimes misuse because I'm not an expert. So there's a difference between a caption and a dialogue balloon and a thought balloon, and you'll see that in these images. The caption, kind of no one's talking, or it's not associated with any one person. It's this weird, just kind of like narrator that knows everything saying it. And then we have thought balloons, and you can tell by these little bubbles that it's a thought, versus a dialogue balloon, which has this like pointed arrow at someone, like that person is talking, okay? We've talked about sound effects, so you can see this like rumble across the way. This is called a gutter, the space in between two panels. And so the panel is here, the line that cuts off, basically. So each of these are little panels. The gutter divides them. The gutters can also be at the bottom of the page and in between larger pages. So sometimes Spiegelman will overlap them. So you'll see what I mean when he plays with the gutters a little bit, and that's important. So normally we're used to panels just being very separate and spread out and with clear space in between, but sometimes they overlap, and that's something to pick up on. Like, why is that overlapping? Why is there more space given to this panel as opposed to the other one? Why is it's called bleeding into the next panel? And so you can see this here. A panel, again, is a distinct segment of the comic containing a combo of text and image. The frame, this is the lines and borders that contain the panels. If something's within the lines, it might be considered stuck or unmoving. It might be just immobile, and that might indicate something about an inability to do something. And then when they break through, it's usually a disruption or a surprise or something big is happening. Again, the gutter is space between frame panels. The bleed is an image that extends to or beyond the edge of the page. So when things kind of overlap in weird ways, that might be a bleed. And foreground just describes what's like right in front of your face. What's the first thing we see? So like in this image right here, in the foreground is this little kid who appears to have an arrow in his head and he's riding an umbrella, whereas the sun or the fire is in the background. Okay. You also want to consider the graphic weight. So the way that some images draw the eye more than others. Sometimes that's done through contrast, sometimes it's done through shading, different patterns. But you as a reader, it's important that you have your opinion. If something draws your eye faster than anything else, that's probably true for most people. So you can definitely make an argument about a paper or about a page that said, like, you can say, well, this aspect of it draws the reader's attention more quickly, and so that must mean that it's more important. Like, that's an assumption that you can make and an argument you can make. I really, really want you to focus a lot on the faces in the text that we're going to read. Open faces so that they lack details. That means that you're going to likely fill it in with your own assumptions and what you believe it's supposed to look like. When faces are more detailed, then they kind of we have less imagination about it. And so the author's kind of just forcing this image onto us. Like, we have to just go with it. Hands reveal emotions by their placement. And also, like, if they're in fists, then it looks like someone's angry. If they're like this, then someone's surprised. So look a lot at where the hands are and just in general where the body placement is. Can we see the face? Is the face hiding? Why is it hiding? What does that do for the reader? Why do you think Spiegelman would do this? Every single decision that Spiegelman makes in this graphic novel is significant and important. He does everything intentionally. So if you pick up on something and you're like, why would you do that? There's a reason for that. And you can come up with that answer and you can probably write a good paper out of it. Okay. There's also feet. Feet do the same thing as hands, but I want you to look at all of the bodies that are portrayed in this text, what they're wearing, how they're shaded in comparison to someone that's next to them. All these tiny little details are extremely important, and they will color the way that you read this text. Okay, so make sure when you read MAUS and you read these first couple chapters that you're really trying to see these little details. And when you actually write your paper about this, you'll have more time, obviously, to pick one panel and to really delve into it and to really get in the details. But for now, I still really want you to try to see as much as you possibly can, okay? Challenge yourselves. And then also see if you can come up with something that nobody's ever pointed out before. It's definitely possible. It happens every year. I want to see new things through your eyes. So please point them out. I want to see all the cool things you notice. So we can also have color contrast. Obviously, MAUS is in black and white, but the black versus the white can still give us a high contrast and can still give us high energy and intensity. There are definitely moments where someone is wearing all black or all white, and it's different from what we're used to, and that's significant. And usually when there's low contrast, everybody kind of looks the same. That usually means nothing significant is happening in this moment. Or, I mean, it's intentional. It really just depends. So you can see in high contrast kind of this orange against blue, and low contrast, like you see a tree, like these are greens and yellows. It doesn't seem to be moving, whereas the first one, this woman seems to have something vibrant about her just because of the colors, right? So those are just some details that you might want to notice when you're reading this book or other ones, other graphic novels. Okay. Line direction is also important. So usually a vertical line brings energy to a picture, whereas a horizontal line seems to indicate slowing down or laying down or some tranquility. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but for the most part. Diagonal energy and jagged is usually danger, and these do overlap, and sometimes authors mess with them on purpose to give us the wrong impression. But you can see in this image the vertical, that someone's like climbing up vertically, and so there seems to be energy in that. Whereas here we see the horizontal, we see kind of like these cute pictures, but they're not scary, they're not intimidating, not an enormous amount is going on in them. There is a little bit of movement, but it seems to be just like we're just very much in this moment, right? Diagonal, like you can see this building is falling down from what appears to be an enormous wave. Also, that other scene is from Sin City when the villain is confronting the hero, and Frank Miller puts it in diagonals so that it's just an intense moment. If you've seen the film or read the graphic novel, it's an extremely intense moment, and it looks intense because of the diagonal lines. If this was a little bit more straight up, like in the prison, it would have felt a little bit more ordinary, but this gives it this kind of creepy vibe, and he does that intentionally. And then jagged is always just, there's something scary going on, something bad is happening. You can see it. The second picture is from The Witches by Roald Dahl. You can see her like claws, and even just her body kind of is all jagged. So jagged usually indicates something horrific is happening. And in that case, I feel like she's preying on some people in the second picture. So definitely something bad is going on there. Okay. So there's also this issue of composition. I should say also, like, you're never going to have to memorize any of this. You're never going to be tested on it. This is just to help you read the text and to write your papers, okay? So size. Basically, whatever is bigger is more important. So you can see in this image, which is from an alternative mouse, look how big the Nazi, the cat, is in comparison to the little mouse. Like, he's enormous. In real life, they're about the same size. But for some reason in this image, Spiegelman wanted to depict the Nazi as being absolutely huge. So when things are bigger, it usually means that they are more important, or that they have more power, or that they're in control, something. It's just important that usually when two people who would normally be the same size, one of them is astronomically bigger or the other one is astronomically smaller, then it usually indicates that there's some sort of power dynamic here that you need to consider and think about. Also, this can just be in height, right? It's the higher, lower. It can also indicate class, as in someone is higher class or has more money, is wealthier because they're taller in the image. It can mean any number of things. But the important thing for you to note is that you should notice it. When you see something like this, it's important to circle it, to make a note about it, to write about it, just so that you're aware of it, okay? So we can see it here too. So that first image is two nuns being very mean to a little girl in the graphic novel called Persepolis. And you can see that they just look enormous next to her. Granted, that's a little girl, so she would probably be smaller. But that size differential is like much too big, right? So you can see that they clearly have the power. They're the disciplinarians. In this case, they're kind of the evil to her in some ways. They're stripping her of her punk is not dead jacket. So you can see just by composition that they're the ones with power. And you can also see that, and this is a later Batman, you can see that they are closer and equal. Even though she's likely much shorter than him, they seem to be nearly the same height. So this seems to indicate some sort of equality here, or respect that he has. I don't know. I mean, I still think it's a little heteronormative and a little bit sexist, but you can read it however you want, and I think intentionally the composition was made so that it reads like they're equal. Shapes are important, so circles usually indicate comfort, and squares and rectangles usually indicate danger or anger or being caught in something that you don't want to be caught in. So shapes like that can also tell you what to think about these moments in the text. I think those are the main things for graphic novels in general. When you read MAUS 1, I want you to pay attention to the following. Symbols. So there's a lot of swastikas, and that's the Nazi symbol. You can look it up if you don't know what that is. And Stars of David, which are basically the stars that have 6 points. See what Spiegelman does with those symbols, because swastikas are obviously they represent the Nazis. They're being used a lot right now with what's going on in terms of social justice. So it might be even more familiar, but I want you to pay attention to the way that he depicts them. I want you to try to see images that reference the Holocaust. So for example, and he'll tell the story a little bit, I think it's more in the, or maybe it's in the first book, that all the Jews that were rounded up, they were transported on trains across the country to get to the concentration camps. And so there's a lot of train imagery in the text in interesting ways. So little things like that that you might not just naturally associate with the Holocaust, you want to try to pay attention to. So the other things that you could think about are smoke, from when they burned the Jews. They would put them in ovens and there would be smoke, right? So any images with smoke can tend to be about the Holocaust in a way that we maybe don't pay attention to that often. So little things like that, I want to see if you can find them and point them out. It's not a test or anything, but if you see something like that, that's usually important. Okay, there's this issue of intergenerational trauma, or what is called post-memory, which is essentially that the trauma of our ancestors, or even just like our parents and grandparents, tends to make its way into our lives in the present. Um, Trauma tends to directly impact the people that undergo that trauma, but then also that changes them, and then in course it changes the people that they relate to, so their children or their grandchildren. So this idea that trauma can pass through generations is significant in this text, because the author of this, R.D. Spiegelman, did not himself survive the Holocaust, but his father did. And yet his life is completely changed by it. And it is altered by his father's experience. His father is not the same person that he was prior to the Holocaust. And so he raises his son very differently. And they seem to have this, the idea of the Holocaust is just kind of hovering over them at all times. There's nothing that Artie can do that isn't related somehow to that. Okay. So I want you to pay attention to the ways that trauma in the past is bleeding into the present. I also want you to think about their father-son relationship. What is going on between them? Is it weird? Is it positive? Is it good? Does it remind you of anything? Just pay attention to their dynamic. And again, thinking about the influence of history on the present. Not necessarily in Art Spiegelman's moment, but in our moment now. How does the past kind of find its way into the present in interesting ways? Just something to consider. Also, I just want to say there are actually really funny moments here, especially where Artie's dad is completely ridiculous in some ways, and we'll see those. So it's okay to have moments where you're like, this is that he's just being ridiculous and he's funny. I think we're meant to laugh a little bit and to realize that, like, he's not just a victim of the Holocaust, he's also a survivor and a person outside of that experience. So pay attention to those things. If you find yourself like, wow, Artie's dad is a little funny, that's okay. You're allowed to laugh at that. There are definitely parts in here that we are supposed to laugh. Okay, so that's it for the lecture. And I will tell you this again when we talk, or I will have already told you this, I think. But read chapters 1 through 3 of MAUS by Monday's class, and that's of the first one. It might seem like a lot. It's not. This reads really, really fast. I think it's, let me see if I can find. You have a weekend to read 1 through 69, but I'm telling you, that would, in a regular novel, you would hate me for that, but it's not going to take that long, I promise. If you sit down, I bet it won't take more than like an hour and a half. If you don't quite make it to the end, that's okay, but just keep in mind that that's going to put you behind for the rest of the novel, so you want to try to stay on top of it as much as possible. And the question that I want you to ask or answer and send to me by 8 p.m. on Sunday in an email, really short, not graded for grammar, really just want to see your reaction and your thoughts on this. Why does Spiegelman start with this short narrative of Artie falling down and running to his father? In the very beginning, page 5, it's just this like short moment where Artie like falls down and hurts himself and runs to his dad, and his dad has an interesting reaction. Why do you think that happens? What does it tell us about Artie, his father, and the impact of the Holocaust? This isn't meant to be a complex question. Just what do you think? Like, why does he start with this? It doesn't seem to have a place. At first, when you read it, it doesn't really kind of make sense why it's there. So take a look at it and see what you think. Write down a couple sentences. Literally, no more than 10 minutes. Don't take more than 10 minutes. If you fill up like 4 pages, I'm going to be upset. So just write for 5 to 10 minutes, your quick thoughts, email it to me. You'll get credit for it. You'll be in good shape. Okay. I also want to say your first paper, and I'll hand out an assignment next week, is going to be analyzing one of the panels in this text. And we're going to talk more and more and more about this. I want you to kind of just jump into the text first before you start thinking about what your job is. And I'll give you like 4 choices for images that I think work really well for analysis. So you'll be able to work with them. Don't stress about it. I'm just giving you a heads up to what the first assignment is. And we will spend plenty of time talking about my expectations, talking about this text. You'll be prepared, I promise. Okay. If you have any questions about this, feel free to email me. If you're confused at all, do not hesitate. I think that's it. I'm going to stop here. If I think of something else, I'll send it in an email now that I have most of your emails. And hopefully maybe by next week, I'll actually have access to Moodle. I can't. I really hope so. Anyway, okay. So I hope you're watching this before you start reading. If you're not, maybe you can go back and get some understanding. I will tell you to do it, but who knows if you will listen. I hope you will. Okay. We will talk soon.